going to pick up where we left off. We're talking about the late adulthood stage. We talked last time some about kind of an overview, looked at some of kind of the myths that we'll be addressing over the next couple of class periods. And today we want to continue looking at some aspects of physical development and some of the physical changes that are taking place. I believe we left off, what was the last one we had? Talking about hearing, I believe, is what we had talked about. Again, many of the changes that we have mentioned are really continuations that started to occur, become more noticeable during middle adulthood. Two other changes, again, though, don't tend to have tremendous impact on daily functioning, but there is an awareness of reduced sensitivity to basic tastes and smells. And some of that may simply be a lack of awareness, particularly in regards to smells that other people may notice that the older adult may simply not be as sensitized to and simply may not notice in the same way. There are what's referred to as receptor cells. These are cells that again receive stimulation from messages from the environment through our senses that then translate messages to the brain that then processes and decodes that. And what we see is decline in receptor cells and sensitivity to those receptor cells as a natural part of the aging process. And that's what contributes, again, to that change in sensitivity to taste as well as smell. Taste is probably somewhat more noticeable, yet at the same time we know that smell can have some influence likewise along with how food tastes as well. And so it's not uncommon for some older adults to comment about food tasting more bland, not enjoying food in the same way as when they were younger, and this is part of it. Likewise, there's decreased sensitivity of touch, and particularly those impacted by the hands. And so, again, those activities that require fine motor skills may be impacted to some extent. And so, again, you don't have quite that sensitivity of the fingers and the fingertips sometimes that may create some difficulty. Can you think of an activity for older adults where that change in sensitivity might have some impact? Something that an older adult might be engaged in. And again, doesn't keep them from being able to participate in those activities, but might have some effect. Anybody think of any activity? Older adults losing some sensitivity in the hands, fingers might affect? Quilting and sewing, I think particularly if you think about there is a need for that fine sensitivity to thread a needle, kinds of things. I notice a little bit, my mother loves to put puzzles together. And then so sometimes just, grabbing a puzzle piece, some of those, and it's not that she can't do it, but there's, some changes there as well. And so sometimes a number of again, the hobbies, the craft activities, those kinds of things, again, activities that involve, again, those fine motor skills can be partially impacted as a result of that. Again, not surprising, things that you're probably already aware of is that bones become more brittle, less flexible. Older adults often experience less strength and reduced endurance. And again, as we've already mentioned a couple times, there's a lot of variability there. I think some of what happens for some older adults depend upon, again, the level of their activity that may be impacted by illnesses that can cause them to be less active. And again, in terms of bones and muscles, when we don't use them frequently, then the efficiency of their performance is going to be diminished some. And one of the things that happens is when older adults do become ill and incapacitated to some extent, it then causes, again, a weakening, again, in this case, in bones and muscles, that kind of creates almost a negative kind of spiraling cycle. My strength, my endurance is reduced. I may not have the energy or the ability to do some of the things that I used to do. I may not feel like doing it, so I do it less. And then to do activities becomes more difficult. The challenge of doing the activities then causes me to be less inclined to be motivated to do them. And it kind of creates that negative kind of spiral and cycle for some older adults. As we've mentioned several times, many of these changes can be minimized with preventive measures. And some of this is beyond sometimes the older adult's control. But again, for those older adults who are able to and capable of, again, staying physically, mentally, emotionally, socially active there's going to be a less decline. And again, it's important to keep in mind that all those areas are still working together. We're focusing primarily on the physical, but my mental state, my social contacts, they're going to impact my physical activity, as well. So they are still related. But again, some of this is beyond some older adults' control. I think one of the saddest kind of situations that I can recall, in some ways, was my father-in-law, who was a very, very physically active person prior to his retirement. Played golf, played tennis regularly, very, involved in social activities, and still after retirement was very much still the case. But he discovered it was almost, and it probably wasn't that close, but it seemed like it, because I remember going to his final retirement event, and I remember him receiving a brand new set of golf clubs. And so one of the things that he was really looking forward in that retirement period, was that ability to get to do some of those activities that he was involved in, but wasn't able to do it to near the extent that he wanted to. And I remember just shortly after that, he discovered that he had a degenerative back problem. And come to find out, and again, I don't know that I know all the facts, but what I do know is that it was due to an experience that occurred years and years ago in his life, playing sports, that basically had gone undetected, and then over the years had a degenerative effect that only began to really surface and create problems in his later years. And so shortly after retirement, he began to experience the difficulty with his back. He went through a number of surgeries, and that over the past number of years, it's become more and more difficult, and literally had to give up the tennis and the golf and those kinds of things. And again, when you're not able to do those things, again, then bones, muscles get less use. And so it's been kind of sad to watch him not be able to be as active as he would like to have been in this stage of his life, and that only progressively seems to be worse. And then to have to deal with not only the physical limitations, but literally the physical pain that he has to endure a great deal of his time. So again, an illustration of how those previous experiences can impact life later on in years. But again, adults who remain active are going to experience considerably less decline in many of these areas. A couple of other things that, again, if you're around older adults and may have experienced, one of the other common complaints and issues for older adults has to do with the experience of feeling cold. They have less active sweat glands and deal constantly with dry skin. Again, many, not necessarily all, do. But as a result, more body heat escapes. And again, you will hear a common complaint, particularly more in that the oldest age group, of being cold. Clearly, this was I've not experienced this at all with my mother, but again, she's very much early in the late adult stage of life, but clearly have very visual memories of it being experienced with my grandmother for as long as I can remember. Now, probably in reality, that has only been probably in the last 10 or 15 years or so. But I remember at one point they put a gas fireplace in the basement, because again, basements tend to be cooler anyway. And she was always having difficulty feeling cold, because her apartment was down in the basement of the house. And so at one point my mom and dad put in a gas fireplace. And I can remember numerous times when that fireplace was going on during the summer, and is on a good bit or was at the time when she was downstairs, a good bit of the time. And it's frustrating, I think, for everyone, because sometimes it's hard to realize that it's not something that they have control over, and it really is their experience of life. But for someone like myself, who rarely is cold to the extent that others are, it's kind of hard to grasp the severity of that experience of being cold. I'll never forget, my grandmother came to stay with my family for 2 or 3 days because she wasn't able to be home on her own. And so she was home during the day, and we had all gone off to work, and my son was at school. And so we came back in, and in our house we have individual thermostats for all the rooms. And I mean, they had been cranked up to 70 or 80 degrees. And I mean, it was just burning up in the house. It was just unbelievable. And my grandmother was just sitting on the couch, just as cozy as could be. And, bottom line is we clearly, she ended up kind of having to be restricted to certain rooms because we just simply couldn't have the whole house that warm. And so with the individual thermostats, she could go to the room that we had prepared for her and she could watch TV and do whatever she wanted there and have it as hot as she wanted so that we could turn down the thermostats in the other room. When my family bought their family car, when my grandmother was no longer able to drive, literally was very intentional about buying a car that could regulate the temperature in different parts of the car. Because she, again, was always cold when everybody else was hot or warm. And again, it's a common issue, again, for many, many older adults. Older skin tends to be more paler, less elastic, and the result of that, a common experience for many older adults is dealing with wrinkles. And what we tend to find is the older adult moves through this stage, tends to experience more wrinkles over the course of their lives. And it's not uncommon as you look at the oldest age group, that most do experience considerable, certain extent of wrinkling. And again, in our society, many spend a lot of effort and time trying to diminish the effects of that or remove them as much as possible. But again, natural part of the aging process. As we've already kind of referred to, as people age, there are shifts and changes, and body systems and organs may become more susceptible to disease because the efficiency of their functioning is diminished, as we've already mentioned earlier. We've also mentioned this before, but just to make a reference to it, heart disease is the most common cause of death in the later adulthood. And if you'll remember back when we were talking about middle adulthood, in middle adulthood it was, anyone remember? Leading cause of adult during middle adulthood? Any guesses? It's not heart disease. Cancer. Second was heart disease, and then what we find is they swap in later adulthood. And so again, and we made reference to this the other day, and as many of you thought about and referred to older adults that you knew, that often heart problems are the most common, or one of the most common chronic kinds of illnesses or diseases that deal with, and obviously not the only one, but in terms of major organs that are impacted. But I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that along with that, the shifting and changing and again, in body systems and organ functioning, is that they are then susceptible to other kinds of illnesses that when younger would not have the potential risk that they do now. Can you think of an example with older adults? As we now kind of move into the cold and flu season, typically that would be problematic in the terms of someone being sick for 2 or 3 days, being very uncomfortable and maybe miserable. What becomes the risk for older adults? Or greater risk, I should say. In terms of what? What might that cold and flu become with an older adult that probably would less likely occur for a younger person? Pneumonia. Yeah, and one of the things that we find a lot of times with a lot of older adults, it's not necessarily always a given disease that creates really medical problems or even potential death, but it's some of the other things that can progress, such as pneumonia. And like I said, what that escalates to in terms of that pneumonia would probably not with someone who is younger, who then had the capacities to maybe fight that off differently. And so again, a lot more concern when an older adult gets a cold, gets a respiratory illness such as maybe bronchitis, much more concern of what and how that might progress than we would be, again, for someone who was younger. Again, along the same lines, there is a decline in what we call the reserve capacity that we have, and that's just simply our body's capacity to meet the demands of life and the stresses of life. And so what we find is there is a decline in this reserve capacity, which then means in stressful situations, my body's not able to react and fight that off in the same way. So particularly under high levels of stress and with those reserve capacities, that increased level of stress, my inability to cope with that can then add to, again, my physical issues, complications. What would be some of the things that might create stress during the late adult years? That, again, younger, when we had the capacities, maybe to better address those, cope with those, might escalate into bigger problems. If you're clearly, and particularly if your health maybe is not real good, but dealing with an aging spouse who is going through a lot of ongoing, particularly chronic illness, would add a lot of stress, a lot of demand that's going to affect your system as well. Excellent. What would be a couple of other common stresses for older adults? Clearly, finances can be, again, with reduced income, or simply meeting some of the basic household demands and stuff, to where if all of a sudden I'm now having to pay for those kinds of services that my spouse might have done or I might have been able to do on my own, can create added financial stress, added financial worries. I remember at my mom's house a couple of months ago, she has a water softener down in the lake area, and so you have to have a water softener for the water to run through, and they have filters. And after so many weeks, the filters, get dirty and they need to be replaced. And when they're not replaced, water flows diminish and all kinds of other things occur. And so I remember I was gone to visit, and I visit most weekends, and I hadn't visited, for a couple of weeks before because of other things that were going on. And so she had to pay someone, and I can't remember now what it was $30, $40 for someone to come out and change water filters that take literally 2 minutes to do. I mean, you unscrew them, put them in, screw them back on. I said, I'll change them. Just let me know ahead of time when you need them done, and I'll make sure that I do that. But for a lot of older adults who don't have someone who can help with those kinds of things and have to pay for them, can be added financial stress, particularly if they are on, which many older adults are on, kind of a fixed, reduced income, kind of situation. A couple other things that could create stress. Obviously, the older adults' illnesses or health themselves could add stress. Anything else that might be stressful for older adults, and particularly if you get 2 or 3 things that are happening simultaneously? Yeah, just simply the stress of maybe not physically being able to or emotionally feeling like doing some of the hobbies and activities you would like to do. That emotional and physical limitation could then add stress, to your life as well. Concern, worry about extended family members, and feeling like there's not much that you can do to help in maybe some of their stresses of life. And again, reduced capacity, increased stress then can have potentially not only emotional implications, but also can affect the physical body as well. And we know that can impact our physical health. All right, shifting gears and looking at mental health. We've talked a good bit about some of the things that are happening physically. Again, we kind of looked at this briefly in our introduction to late adulthood, but again, one of the kind of common stereotypes or myths of late adulthood is that most older adults are senile. And so we often joke about, and sometimes older adults will too, and they'll make a statement like, well, I think I'm just losing my mind, or even to a stronger extent, I think I'm just going crazy, And for some older adults, there's a real concern that may happen. And again, I think what that does is feed into that stereotype that that's a part of aging. And what we really find that's not necessarily an inevitable part of aging. And that for most older adults, their mental health is good. Their mind is sharp. What have you found about the older adults that you know? Diminished mental health? Minds that still tend to function pretty well? What have you found? Yeah. Okay. Again, often still a lot of reflection and awareness of dates and events, in their lives. And again, a lot of the older adults I've known, I've seen very little changing in my grandmother's mental health in a lot of ways. And those that have been really caused more as a result of illnesses and diseases and medication, I think, than anything to do. I mean, her mind is still very, very sharp. At times emotional issues as a part of aging, but mentally, really, for someone, again, who's in their 90s, very, very in touch with what's going on around her and in touch with reality, those kinds of things. Anyone else in terms of what you remember about older adults that you're in contact with in terms of mental health? And that would not be necessarily always typical of all older adults, but again would be clearly an indication of someone in later years who has still very, very strong mental capacities, again, to be able to maintain those kinds of connections. Because for some, remembering those kinds of details, that often is very, very difficult. And yet she's able to do that and maintain those connections and awareness of who's who goes with who, what's going on in their lives, those kinds of things. So again, to dispel kind of that myth or stereotype, most older adults really are in good mental health. Dementia, and probably is not a term that people are overly familiar with or aware of, is a general term for physiologically based cognitive and behavioral deterioration. So again, when we talk about that portion of adults who do experience as a part of the aging process some deterioration, particularly in that are, and again, physiologically is referring to there are physical changes, often changes that are taking place in the brain, frequently degenerative, that then affects cognitive processes and will have some impact on behavioral functioning as well. Because again, those are so closely tied together. My perceptions, my thought processes will influence pretty strongly my emotional reactions as well as my behavioral responses to different situations. Again, I can't emphasize enough that it's not an inevitable part of aging, and that all aging adults are going to experience, to the same extent, this kind of deterioration, in that overwhelming fear that I'm going to lose my mind, I'm not going to remember, those kinds of things. But there is a portion of adults that it is their experience, but it's not inevitable for all older adults. We tend to joke a lot. I know as my own memory has clearly declined, I sometimes joke about, that's going to happen to me as I get older and older and I won't be able to remember anything. And my family tends to believe that may be true as well. Probably the most common, or a lot of times when we think of dementia, or we think of that which impacts cognitive behavioral functioning, we often think of Alzheimer's disease. I'm sure that most of you are fairly aware of what that is. It is progressive. It's degenerative brain disorder that gradually robs people of intelligence, awareness, and even the ability to control bodily functions. And when it degenerates to a certain point where there's not the ability to control bodily functions, ultimately is life-threatening. My wife, in her profession, visits a lot of older adults and does a lot of visiting in nursing facilities. And she could share with you a number of very humorous kinds of, I don't know if they're humorous at the time, but experiences that she's had where people have been confused about who she was and why she was there, and I'm not going to get into the details, but again, a lot of it in terms of that disorientation and confusion. But what's interesting in what you shared is that a lot of times what often happens is the inability at some point in time to recognize, familiar family members. And so there often comes a point where they're not even sure. And it's interesting that she would have some confusion in some areas of her life, yet still aware of who you were. And the reasons for that are hard to explain or know. Again, with the brain reorganizing itself, clearly it results in certain connections not taking place, and then the difficulty to make connections in life. And it's interesting that she would remember some things and not. And again, that's probably not all that uncommon. And my guess is, as time went along, that probably became less the case. Again, particularly in the later, later stages. Early symptoms are loss of memory, followed by confusion, as we've already mentioned, irritability, disorientation. One of the things that you will find, and again, it goes back to the point you were making earlier, is that at some point in time it becomes more and more difficult to provide direct care because you almost have to provide almost ongoing immediate supervision, or at least to begin to make some kinds of allowances, almost like what we would do with a very, very young child. Because one of the things that's common in that disorientation and confusion is for, again, an adult with Alzheimer's, and again at different stages, to wander off. And again, a lot of times probably in their own mind they have some idea where they're going, but they're not sure how to get there or where they are when they get there. but there are obviously some things that are mentally going on in their minds. And I've heard numerous stories of again, an Alzheimer's patient who was at home. The adults caring for them, wasn't as aware of that potential. In other words, doors aren't locked, and a person just, wanders off and leaves. And the difficulty is when they finally get someplace, they often don't know who they are, where they were going, where they came from, and how to get back. My wife, I remember I was gone. I hadn't come home from work yet, and was home, and someone showed up at the doorstep. Knocked on the door, and sure enough, it was a woman who had Alzheimer's. It come to find out, and it was just really difficult because my wife kept trying to find out, and she kept talking, but nothing made sense, in terms of where she was going, and couldn't tell her where she lived or where she had come from or who she was, And at some point, she finally decided, I can't help her because I don't know anything, and so she finally called the police. And about the same time that she had called the police, the daughter of the woman had realized that she was gone and had called the police. And so anyway, they were able to get them back, kind of back together. But again, a common experience that often occurs. It will progressively, as we've said, get to the point where bodily functions, body organs just simply shut down, and then results in death. Anyone else have had experience either with a family member who gone through Alzheimer's or possibly worked in a setting with Alzheimer's patients? What are some of the things, if so, that you remember are characteristic?
Mm-hmm. Stuff. And the other day she was talking about how Princess Di being alive and just different things. And you just listen and
you just listen, you acknowledge, and celebrate her birthday every other day or whatever the experience may be. Again, just different gaps in terms of connection with reality. It goes back to your experience of forgetting that so-and-so was married and we're no longer married, and and the numerous accounts of affairs that are taking place or whatever. And it's hard to figure out. You wonder kind of what all is going on, within the mind. I think the most difficult thing for family members, at least what little I understand, is simply to deal with watching someone go through those changes, knowing that you can't change that from occurring, and watching them become somebody different than who you knew and who you remembered. And again, I think that's the hardest thing for family members, is this sense of helplessness and hopelessness of not being able to help when you want to be able to to help, and then knowing that you watch that over time progress, kind of thing. A lot of times when we think about again mental health, we often think about a couple things: memory and the ability to learn. I left a word out here inadvertently. I think one of the most important things to keep in mind, and you'll review some of this in your reading, is that older adults are very capable of learning. Again, when we think about mental capacities, one of the things that comes to mind is our ability to gain new knowledge and to learn new skills. And that continues way into adulthood. They do need to take in small, and what I left out, amounts of information at one time. I think the places where older adults have some difficulty with learning, particularly in formal settings, is they can become more fairly easily overwhelmed if they get a lot of information all at once, because it takes them a little bit longer to process that information, integrate it into their current, and reorganizing their current concepts and schemes. And so they have to reorganize it, and that takes a little bit longer than it may have during younger years. But again, very capable of taking in new knowledge, reorganizing that, adding to that, and expanding their learning experiences of life. I've been amazed at older adults that I've known in my own life, the things that they have done and accomplished in later adulthood in terms of learning and acquiring new skills. I mentioned the other day, one of the things that my grandmother picked up in late adulthood was carving. And so she has a number of these figurines. She's always been fascinated by cowboys in the Wild West and spent a lot of her time on farms growing up. And I look at that and I think there's not a way in the world I could do that. And again, she did this in later years and carved, she doesn't do near as much carving now. Again, part of it changes in hands and takes, again, a lot of fine motor dexterity to do carving. But I think she does a pretty decent job. And she does it just for her own satisfaction. I mean, she doesn't sell them, but they're as good as anything I've seen, in the craft stores that people sell. The other thing that she took a number of classes, taught herself, and still does to this day is to paint. Again, she will take pictures and will simply recreate and draw pictures. And to me, I'm fascinated by the fact that I know what that picture is. I mean, I can recognize, the figures in there. And she's done numerous paintings. I have several in my house. And I think she does a pretty decent job. Again, for someone who probably doesn't have a lot of natural artistic ability per se, but someone who just simply has taught themselves to do something that she really has enjoyed, doing. And like I said, she still, when she feels like it, still, will paint, to this day. I don't know. My dad took up what I thought was a fascinating one, massage therapy. He really did. I don't know how he got fascinated with massage somehow. First started on the internet, looking up information on the internet, and then he ordered some books and started reading up on it. And then to top it all off, he took a couple classes at OTC in massage. And then he bought him a massage table, bought the oils and stuff, and he was the neighborhood masseuse. And I mean, literally, people from the neighborhood would come down, and he really was very, very good. He really was, and he really enjoyed doing that. And he was just fascinated by that, And it was funny because he could tell you all about all the different pressure points, and what you press to release tensions and all these kinds of things. And literally, people from around the neighborhood, when they had overexerted themselves or really stressed out, came down and he would do, one of his free massages, and they always claimed that they felt better. So again, older adults very capable of still learning new information, over time. When we think about memory, we really think about short-term memory and different types of long-term memory. Working memory, again, is another term for short-term memory. Most of you know this from your psychology class. Short-term memory holds a small amount of information for brief periods of time. We do see, as we get older, some decline in this area of short-term memory. Anybody think of an example, again, from your experiences in interacting with older adults, of short-term memory? There's one that's just, and talking about generally now, not necessarily specifics, though it could be. Anyone seen examples of difficulty with short-term memory in older adults that you've interacted with? Sometimes older adults have difficulty with names, And there's nothing more frustrating than seeing somebody and you know who they are and that name just won't come, And particularly if it's someone you really should know, kind of thing. Other examples. I think where I notice it the most, and I don't know if you've had this experience again with older adults that you have maybe some common interactions, and you just kind of learn to adjust to it and go with it, but it was how many times they will tell you the same thing again. With my dad, I used to hear, in a given weekend that we might spend together or part of a day, sometimes I'll hear the same story 3 times, and we find that even, with other adults, in-laws and stuff, you call and you give them the information about things that are coming up or when you're going to show up for something, and a couple days later they'll call back, now, when was that you were coming? And well, we just went over that yesterday, and again, just a lot of the kind of the daily things of names, places, time frames, those kinds of things. And though I'm clearly a long ways from late adulthood, I even notice that inside of myself, which is why I have found that I have to write down everything. Because if someone tells me something, I can forget it real quickly, and I think that happens a lot for older adults. Numbers sometimes, what used to be really familiar isn't as familiar. So again, we do see some changes in short-term memory. And again, there are a lot of ways for older adults to kind of compensate and work with those if they're aware of it and just simply acknowledge it as part of what's happening. And so you tend to write things down more. So we do see declines in working memory. There are 3 types of long-term memory. And this one will surprise you a little bit, but maybe not. Semantic memory is simply a person's general knowledge about the world. And I think one of the things that's amazing to us is how many factual pieces of information that we learned years and years ago that we hold on to. If I were to ask this entire class, and I imagine that most of you would be able to answer, who was the first president of the United States? I'm not going to ask because someone may answer incorrectly. Most of you would be able to answer that. Now, if I were to ask you, when was the last time you were taught that? How old were you likely to have been? Where formally you were taught that information? Huh? Yeah, probably someplace back in elementary school. May have been reinforced, a couple of times later on in your education. But my guess is for most of you, that's not content that you've recently studied. Yet you still remember that. Can someone real quickly think of a piece of trivia, general fact that you still remember today, but there's really absolutely no logical reason why you would? Excellent example. Again, how to spell, and how to spell a word. And what's more interesting is how you remembered how to spell that, kinds of things. Anyone else? Just piece of trivia, general knowledge. And some of it is the fact that, you still have knowledge, can spell words of words that you may not even used in years. But again, just basic general knowledge about the world, about life. That's what we refer to as our semantic memory. And amazingly, how much bits of information we retain. And again, I think what's most important is the bits of information that we don't use, on any kind of regular basis, yet we still remember, we still know. The other type of memory that we hold on to really well is what we call procedural memory. And that is just simply refers to our knowledge of how to do something. Again, you're not older adults or anywhere near close to it, but can you think of something that you know how to do that you haven't done in a long time? Can you think of an example? See, a lot of it is, are those things that we know how to do. And even if we haven't done them for a long period of time, we still know how to do it and are still capable of doing it. Can you think of examples? I'll give you just a real stereotypical example. I can't remember the last time I physically rode a bike that wasn't stationary. I've got a stationary bike that I ride pretty regularly, But I bet you that, and I do have a bike, but I bet you it's probably literally been 20 years since I've been on that bike. But I bet you I could get on it and I could ride it. I still know how to do it. I'd still be able to do it even though I haven't done it for 20 years. Other examples, just things that we know how to do. Excellent. Good example. How to drive a stick. And even though you may have driven an automatic, for the last 25, 30 years, if you were in a situation where you needed to, you would be able to do it. And so most of just the skills, the knowledge of how to do something doesn't get lost. May not have done it for a long time. We may be a little rusty in some of those, but we would still know how to do it and be able to do it to a certain extent. Now, different from what several of you have reflected on, the place where we do find the greatest decline is in what we call our episodic memory. And that's the retention of information about events of our lives, the people and places. And I think one of the things that happens is probably the reality is older adults can still talk a lot about the events of their lives. But what may have happened, say, over the course of the last 50 years? They still refer to a lot of those events, and some have excellent episodic memories. But I think sometimes a lot of what happens is some of the fine detail of some of those events, what happens to them over time? They're gone or more likely have changed. They have a reference to an event, but to really be able to remember the specific details of those events probably have shifted and changed somewhat over the years. And that is the area where we tend to see much greater declines. But again, remember that's in comparison to the other two. And again, with semantic and the procedures that tend to remain fairly strong, that really isn't as surprising as it may seem. And then again, there are some older adults that have very vivid, very specific details, very accurate of experiences and events in their lives that occurred a long time ago. But there are probably more events and experiences that we have forgotten. And they may simply not have been that meaningful, that eventful, of events. And there clearly are some things that we'll never forget, probably a lot more that we forget than we realize. Where we want to begin to move to is to look at the last two areas, and that is to look at emotional and social development, and these will clearly overlap with each other to a certain extent. Again, as we've done all along, looking at Erickson's psychosocial stages, looking at the final stage is integrity versus despair. Anyone happen to remember what it was for middle adulthood? Again, I think it's one of the harder ones because they're not terms that jump out at us. Anyone happen to recall? Either the excellent generativity versus stagnation. Wonderful. And what this really is kind of a continuation, which they all have been to a certain extent, of that preceding stage. And so during late adulthood, older people, basically what they do is they take a look at their life. You know, we did that at middle adulthood, but at middle adulthood we had the opportunity still to make some changes and do some things differently. We tend to do less of that, particularly in the late adulthood stage of our lives. And so what we do is we take a look at our lives. Integrity is the positive outcomes that comes with those adults who truly can look at their life and basically conclude what? And we probably know many adults that can honestly say that. Just in general, what would they say? And that would be a reflection of integrity. I've lived a good life. You know, overall, life's been good. You know, they may be able to look back and say, I would do some things differently. But it's amazing how many older adults will actually say, if I could go back and relive it, I wouldn't do a whole lot differently. You know, that they're pretty content with their life, the life they're experienced, and that it's been good. And to some extent, at some point in time and during this stage, what must we really eventually come to terms with? And that's the acceptance and the reality of the inevitable, passing of our lives. And it's a lot easier to face that when we can look at our lives and say, I've had a good life. I've lived a long, good life. Things have turned out pretty well. I've achieved most of the goals that I've had. Relationships have been good. Life's been good. And then I'm ready for that final phase or stage of life. The negative outcome would be that for those older adults, and hopefully it's not many, but I bet you we all know at least one, that when they really look over the course of their lives, their end result, unfortunately, is one of despair. Because when all of a sudden they look over their lives and they begin to realize relationships didn't turn out the way that I wanted them to. I didn't fulfill a lot of the goals that I had. I didn't achieve near what I hoped to achieve. Part of that may be caught up in the fact that, the last 10 or 15 years of my life, I've been pretty physically, incapacitated. I've been in a lot of pain, and so when I look over the course of my life, it's hard to see much that's good, and that's hard to face and to accept. My hope, and I believe it'll be true when I get to that phase of life, I can also say life's been good. I've lived a good life, accomplished most of what I wanted to accomplish, and for me, most importantly, that I can get to that point and I can still, say that I've got positive relationships, particularly with those people that are most important, to me. So again, integrity versus despair. Life been good, or do I have a lot of regrets about my life that at this point I know I can't really change. I can't do, much about. We'll continue with emotional development next time and then move into social development.